Hello, my name is Brent Click, and together with my wife, we own a restoration, metal shaping, machine shop, make machines, products, bring products to market, all sorts of fun design work, and we just have a lot of fun. What we're doing here is we're showing how we make a repair on a 60s Bronco Grille. This has rusted out in this bottom corner from like the parked with the tire sitting low or something. Normally you see more rust on that side of the vehicle anyway from hitting puddles along the side of the road, but this truck has sitting water almost damage. So what we have here is, you saw the paper, how I made the tuck, where it shows how the metal needs to be gathered in order to make that curvature. So we run it the power hammer and snipping off some excess to kind of show where I want to terminate the panel along that inside body lip. So I had the kind of a flat flange up there, making a few marks so I can have the right size fold over and all the edges, and this is a pretty important part of it. So originally I was wanting to do this where I folded the back reverse pan flange for the back where it mounts to the fender, but that didn't work. I just didn't cut myself originally a large enough panel, or either that or I shrunk too far in on that first shrink because I ended up trimming more on this side. So there I'm marking a rough body line where it starts that little flat section, and we're doing the shrinking. And shrinking, you can shrink further in or further out, and if you shrink further in, you have to shrink further out to bring that area flat. It's the best part of metal shaping, shrinking, because it moves metal so quickly. And stretching takes usually a little longer unless you're working near an edge, which then it's like right up, But so we're bringing that in, planishing it, using a flat die there to flatten that edge, so that was that nice little tool. So you have to over shrink it a bit because planishing is like hammering and stretching, so it's going to bring it back out. So there we are, I'm making a little mark where I want to bring it in, bending it over the knee, so it has enough shape, it's just not in the right configuration, all that other tipping at the edge and everything. And you see like the top end of it is kind of opening out. I'm going to probably run it through a tipper here soon, tipping wheel, and run it. I actually have a electric powered one of these real nice Milton Brothers, but I've had this one and beefed it up over the years. I've had this since 9th grade, I believe. So the hard part of buying a tool is not buying the tool in any way. It's usually the training your brain to use it in your set methods and ways. And obviously I'm gone here to test fit it on the part and make sure I'm kind of true in that lineup and getting it where I want it. That is for that flat flange, that flat face of the front of the grill. And it looks really good whenever you do these grills and you just make that flat area so nice and crisp, because the factory stamping, being a utility vehicle, it was just kind of a little meh. It looked like a lazy little rollover, and it was sharper in some sections than others. And if you really take the time to kind of crisp it up all around, it looks really good. So anyway, so trying to remember to use the electric one versus this old thing is the hard part of that. Originally when I had this, it wasn't even mounted on the English wheel. I used to lay it on an old stool and back in the mini truck days and just have someone put their hand on it and use it to kind of vertically feed the metal. So I've had a lot of dies for this over the years and just used to using it. So there we are, we're shrinking more because tipping it brought it down more. We're pushing down on it. You see we're really, actually what this is not that flat area. This is the inside bottom edge where it fits against the bumper. So as I shrink it, I'm forcing that nice down and forcing it to come around, so that way I'm not taking out that curvature I put in early with the power hammer by the shrinking. And that's all just going to test fit. You see a lot of drift cars in the background. That's kind of what I like to play with. That's my main customer base. You have a hard time getting paid by the classic car guys. They watch a lot of TV and they don't understand what goes into this, and they think this kind of stuff could be done quickly. But really, by the time this grill is finished, every little dent and hail dent or mark and every little edge fixed, you're going to have 45 hours in that grill before you ever take in a paint booth, and then you're still going to paint it, which isn't taking minutes, but and then you're going to cut and buff it, and then you're going to meticulously assemble it and put it on the vehicle, and classic cars just end up taking thousands of hours and at least hundreds of hours on even simple projects like the Bronco, and they're not always worth it. So here we're taking those little corners and bringing them all together. That's going to make my nice little corner piece, even though I am going to have that return flange as a separate piece. If I had done it, like you see the little edge there, if I had done it all in one, I would have had to work inside the piece, because there would have been no way to get into a tool. I would have had to work inside that edge and been that little return flange down. So I would have had to work with that with a tucking fork and work it by hand, because you can't get it into a tool there, which I was wanting to do on this originally, but for sake of the cost of the time and everything, I was marking the width of the flange back where the flange is still existing. Down the bottom is rusted off entirely, so I wanted that flange nice width. Not really taking a lot of measurements, working off just holding the metal, making marks or scribes. When I do bend this, which you're about to see, I'll come back in a second, it's not the crispest bend. I slid the top of the brake back, so that way it would give it a more radius bend. So that way, even though when I weld these two together, I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap and then put it together so about the thickness of the metal, or twice the thickness of the metal. So that way this actually replaces the piece instead of just sitting on it. If you make it sit on it and then you cut the old piece out and try to weld it in, you're going to end up with it being proud on one side or both sides, and it just doesn't work out that well. So I obviously didn't show shrinking that bottom base piece, but we did shrink that one top of the edge, and only the top of the edge, because shrinking the whole edge would have twisted it and made it follow like a 3D curve spline for that edge. So that's what I'm doing right there. There's the shrunk bit there. I forgot to film that, and so we're fitting the two pieces together, starting to trim. We're only gonna use that edge against where the bumper fits, just to the off the main piece, and we'll just use the return flange. I don't like to weld on the corners. I do that very rarely. I say that I have a car in here that I am welding on an edge just because of the complexity of the part, but I don't like welding on edges. Haven't done it in years until this piece came along. But so I like to at least 3/4 of an inch to an inch wider if possible. It means more work around the edge, because shrinking and stretching, getting all to fit right. But at the same time, it means that your heat is away from that edge, so you can hammer and dolly it. You can run it through the planching hammer. You can stretch it back out, get it right, get it where you want it, and not actually mess with the edge. You can make the panel flat again. Welding always distorts everything, so you have to plan for that. The actual shaping of the panel, it was the fastest part of this. Now you see we're trimming and fitting and overlaying and welding and filing and grinding. That's where the work of all this is. Give me a big hood panel or something to shape, or a quarter panel or something. I'll have so much fun making the main bit. But once we have to get into all the folded edges and the taillight recesses and all that kind of stuff, that's where it's really going to take a lot of time. And that's where all my mistakes are made. Or at least that's where the mistakes you make in the panel are compounded. And I notice these, and that's one of the parts that I've always really kind of like, oh, I need to improve this. Oh, I need to improve this. Whereas the main shaping bit, you can learn a new little technique or a new way to run something through a hammer or make a new set of dies for something, and instantly you see an immense improvement. But edge work is the work. So here I have the two pieces. I'm going to tack it together. My tack actually doesn't stay together. I tried tacking again too close to it and melted my original tack, so you'll see that in a second. But again, about the learning to use the tools that you have, it was pretty new at the time, but you see the little gas shutoff thing. I got that from Jerry Gully. I think he found that for me, and when I was looking for one. And it's a little Smith shutoff valve that you can leave your torch set up at a specific setting, and then you hang your torch on it, and it shuts the gas off and leaves it on the same setting, so you just relight it. Don't have to do all this adjusting again and again like you see in the video. And it was pretty new at that point. I just put it on that little table. I have both torches hooked up to the same tanks and flashback arresters and everything, keeping it safe. So it's a nice little roll around. I was frustrated with the size constraints and stuff I had working with the time when I built that, but now I've gotten used to it. I like it. like how the bottles kind of sit in the middle of the table with this little chain holder, and it just has its own little hanger underneath that made of scrap, and it's a good little, nice little non-purpose built table. Just quickly made in a day, just to keep me from having to have this on my main welding table, where often I have jigs and stuff set up, and it just keeps the mess away from there. Oxyacetylene, when you're setting it all up, you put soot out, and or you're shrinking, annealing a panel, or doing a hot spot shrink or something. It's just nice to have be able to roll it around and not have to take off whatever you're doing. There's actually the Bronco in the background sitting on our rotisserie, and it's a new truck build basically. I did do some shrinking on the fenders to make them fit to the original grill before I started repairing the grill. So I knew I probably did do some little cleanup work or edge work again later after that, just like minute thousands of inches here and there. Bodywork is actually harder the more accurate you make your panel, because when you're getting that tight, whenever you get that accurate with it, the high spot is a high spot of metal, and you have like so many in so tight of an area, and your filler and your primers are thinner and thinner, and it's more and more standing work because you sand till, so versus being enough off that you just skim the whole thing and you kind of only have a few spots showing. If it looks like a few islands in the ocean versus it looking like the pelt of some animal, when it looks like that pelt and it feels good, there's nothing better than that, because your repair is so thin. I don't put body filler on bare metal. I only put it on epoxy. So if I do have to wipe over a bare metal spot, I've got to epoxy it again, and then I got to wait 2 days before I wipe again. So any precision or anything in bodywork like that just saves so much time. So here we are attacking it. I'm not like those old Italian guys you see in videos where they're holding the end of the panel out and they're just twisting it into shape as they go down the line tacking, and they're letting the welds heat up and cool to line their tacks, and they're just twisting the panel, and then when it's finished it just still fits perfectly. I'm amazed by that. I've done it, and then I've held it up and been like, wow, I totally warped the crap out of this, or my tacks are this area, like they shift a little bit and the whole thing doesn't fit right. And so I do this slower, but it ends up being a faster job for me for that, just because of the little bit of skill I'm lacking there. So, but if I could gas weld every day, all day, and just practice, I would love that. I'd get better. So it's one of those things with especially this kind of work, you always pick out your weak spots and you just obsess over them. It's just that kind of work. So what I'm doing here is I'm overstretching where I'm going to be welding. Well, I'm stretching the weld there because it did pull in, but I'm overstretching where I'm going to be welding, so that way when I weld, it kind of pulls it down and in, and it ends up being a lot better. That's nice to do on doors or something, so that way you're not welding yourself into a corner that you can't get out. So here we are getting ready to finish welding this. I'm welding like a silicone level 6 rod. That's the last number in your ER75, S2, S6, S4, whatever. That's your silicone content. With gas welding, I really like a higher silicone. It makes it kind of droop and flow a little better. It's harder on the ends. If you're welding around a lot of sharp corners, grab a less silicone content, and that's why when I have take rods out, I only grab what I need out of the box, so I don't have a bunch of unidentified rods with the ends bent off, with the identification off. I can see what I have and grab it. Always, also, one of the biggest tricks I ever learned was to wipe off your rods. Keep everything clean. Wipe your hand off before you hold the rod. Anything you can do to get oils and just anything out of that is just going to help. Wiping oil off all your tools before you put them away is a big thing too. Any sort of oil, grease, any dirt contamination messes with everything in this, from the metal shaping, if you get it on the back of the panel and run it through a pair of dies and gets it pressed in the metal, all the way to paint prep and buffing, and just dirt and grease and oil, and any of that is your enemy. So I always like to stay really clean. So here we are, finished welding it. Nice even heat affected zone. You still see it did run to that edge. Thankfully it did. You can kind of tell that the heat affected zone ends on that edge, but it's going to mean a little bit more planishing later. If I gotta have a nice real tight heat affected zone like TIG welding, that would have been nice, but then my shrinking would have been more localized. And anytime I can get a big hammer and dolly in there behind it, like a Model A roof or something, I like to gas weld it because I know it's going to be softer metal, a softer weld that I can hammer out and move it around and make it fit the way I want. It's going to be a lot nicer for me. Whereas MIG welding is just, it's such a hard weld. Same like with welding aluminum with a spool gun or something. It's a harder rod or harder filler material because it has to stay together through the spool gun versus a nice soft TIG rod where you're only feeding it in by hand. That's all. You can't have a softer rod in a MIG welder because that's really why it's a harder weld. It's also automatically feeding it, so you're going to end up with a lot more. If you have more weld, you have to have more grinding. You have to have, and all that is heat. You have to have more weld, more grinding, more hammering, more shrinking. It pulls it in, more shrinking, so you got to stretch it back out. So if you have less heat in it, you can hammer it out better. So just like how we started with a paper template, I got into metal shaping young because I like paper models. I like making the shapes of the planes and wings and cowls and making pictures of go on encyclopedia and find cool shaped things and try to make it out of paper, whether a building or a plane or something. I like the shapes, and I like I couldn't afford to do things of how they were built really, so shaping was kind of a cheap entrance way to my love of mechanical things. So once I kind of started working in body shops, and this was in the early 2000s. Remember the guys doing lines of coke off the trunks of cars and stuff, and being like, "Oh, I better not tell my mom that; she won't let me come back." But just a different time. A lot of guys just caving stuff in and covering it in body filler. And then I'd go over to their little house workshop on the weekend, and they were building some hot rod or a mini truck, and the metalwork was just impeccable. And I was like, why don't you do this at work? Well, we got to get enough done to pay the bills. So I feel like I do a nice job with trying to keep a customer happy by keeping the hours down. It still is extensive work. I like everything fully welded. I like I don't just tack weld it and seam sealer or so much other stuff you see nowadays in the custom industry. I really like everything solid welded. I like to get the metal as smooth as possible. I like my bodywork to be just as thin as possible. I really, I'll beat myself up and feel like something's too thick. I'll grind it out, hammer it out, do it on my own time or something. But I just, take a lot of pride in that. And I always like to shape as large of a panel as possible. I mean, I could have just silicon bronzed up those little holes and then put a new flange on. Probably would it have taken just as long. Probably would it have been as good a repair. No. Maybe saves the customer, half an hour of time, but what's that matter if it's going to rust out again in 20 years versus however long this lasts? We have better materials than we had back then, so I really expect to see how long these things. I'm excited to see how long a lot of this stuff lasts, like these epoxy primers and all. I have some pieces of epoxy prime that I've thrown in the dirt and thrown in the gutter and thrown on the roof, and they're still sitting there, and I check on them once a year and see how the sun affects it, how the water affects it, how the dirt affects it, and I've got different thicknesses on different parts, and I see whether the moisture can get underneath it and lift, and I like to test my primers. The problem with this is the paint industry, and everything moves along at a faster rate than we can do longevity tests on. That's why cars in the 90s had so many paint problems. We didn't know what they looked like after 10, 15 years because the paint technology wasn't that old. So whenever you see a neon with the paint flying off going down the interstate, that's why dry times and cure times and times between putting the base coat down and putting the clear coat down. If you're reading a 10-year-old bodywork book, you're reading 10-year-old data. Try to talk to people doing it more. Try to talk to your paint suppliers, and even then, just play with a few experiments. Make sure. Oh, you can see on the back. There's our flange finally. Stretching the welds out. You see it's a little offset here. That's going to come out as I stretch because right now it's all tuckered in from being pulled in. It's kind of like making a little baby butt panel. And see, it's we're going to put a little tack on that, then we're going to hammer that out, and that'll stretch it right out. And you see the flange is the same width as the rest of the panel, and I'll drill some holes. That way it lines right up with the fender. It'll look pretty good. So, more gas welding. It probably would have saved a few minutes to take welding it, but I feel like the outcome was just better with gas on this, just because of the age of the metal, the thickness of the metal. I don't gas weld on modern cars. The metal's just different. So, thinner. The heat spreads out faster, kind of like how it spreads out on aluminum. And like on the intro of this, you see the picture of the cafe bike piece, and that's aluminum. And I did it with a nice thicker aluminum, so I could sand and file out the lines. But steel, you don't always have that, especially with a repair piece like this, because you're already working with a set thickness. If I take that as welds and I really grind them down, I mean, I think I only DA'd it. I don't think I have a camera shot, but I just took a DA over it, and then like a little red scuff pad, a little Ziz wheel on the high-speed grinder. That just kind of did a real quick polish on it so I could see my reflections and see how the light does. I blew the torch out with the weld. Must have been a little bit of grease or hand grease or something off it, or a little bit of something in there just kind of popped. So I like to... The point of replacing this corner was to not have the metal thin. If you go and you grind and you smooth, like see that was just a DA, and then I think a little red Ziz wheel scuff pad. You see how it's now shiny. I'm able to kind of see the reflection a little more. It's an even texture, so I can rub my hands over it and feel the shape. You do see the little black lines on either side of the welds where it's still where obviously nothing has sanded or filed in there, and sure, I could grind that out to make it look good for an Instagram photo, but isn't the point of this to replace it to have it good thick metal? So I don't want to use too thick of a piece of metal that have to grind this down, and then you don't want to grind down the parent metal, the original panel, because you want that to be as thick as possible. That's the point of the repair. So if it takes 2 coats of primer, or a coat of primer, or a little bit of a wipe to smooth that out better, I'd rather actually have a wipe than multiple coats of primer. I'd rather have a nice epoxy coat, a little thin wipe, another epoxy coat, and sand it all between. So just have it all sealed. I'd much rather have body fill than layered up primer or slick sand or any of that other kind of, Band-Aid type body work. So use my little ball Pexo hammer from the 1920s. There's my little Martin hammers. I do make my own heads for those now. I've made that same hammer with like an extra 4-inch extension hand for doing inside the 44 doors and things like that. Hit it with a quick file just to kind of bring up any little spots. And there's just more to show the highs and lows on against a flat board like that, like the straight nice file to show the kind of highs and lows, more though than trying to knock it down. Because again, I don't want to make the panel thinner. And I would much rather see these seams and do a little bit of body work, because you're going to do that anyway, no matter how smooth it is. But here's the finished product, and I hope you guys have a good night.